Next item on the agenda is to review and discuss the rental registration program. Mr. Scheffler.
Mayor and Council, we've returned this matter back to the work session from a couple of weeks ago when we had this initial discussion with you. And I think, as you know, this was a carryover from the budget. In fact, staff's interest at that time was to, I think, simply add additional dollars to the permit process, the registration process, with a recommendation from $50 to $75, which we still feel is important, and we'll go through those discussions with you additionally tonight. But I know the council has had some additional thinking in terms of means by which we could maybe enhance this program, and we've certainly been mindful of that and wanted to speak to those points as well as bring back a couple of the items that you asked us for some further clarification on. So we know this is important to y'all. It's a near-term action item, and it's also one that is a hangover item from the budget itself. And hopefully tonight we'll be able to address the remaining points of interest with you. So, Don?
Great. Thank you, Bill. Mr. Mayor and Council, I appreciate the opportunity to come back before you tonight and revisit some of the key considerations that we first visited on about 2 weeks ago. Just prior to that, and just kind of as a reminder, we didn't feel it was necessary to go through all of the background and the current manner in which the program is administered, but we did want to highlight those for you, so if there were any follow-up questions, we could go ahead and address those before we get into the consideration. So just as a reminder, as Bill mentioned, this was a near-term action item that you identified to reconsider the program as it's currently administrated, as well as, and importantly, I think, to try to identify alternatives and strategies to increase compliance and the effectiveness of the program overall. On October 24th, we began by reviewing the current program. We discussed the goals of the initial program. We looked at registration and registration renewal processes as they're implemented today. We identified manner in which we, city staff, go out and proactively seek to identify rental properties and ensure that we're gaining as many of the properties being used in that manner as we can through our inventory and follow-up processes. We looked at the inspection process itself, the things that we look for when we're actually out there, and the criteria. And of course that led to one of our policy and procedural recommendations, which included three primarily. One was the interactive online map in which any resident or neighborhood or homeowner association could go online, and almost on a daily basis the information would be regenerated, and you could either look at on a home-by-home basis by utilizing the map, or you could print off a full list of rental properties for an area by exporting to an Excel. We showed you how we would begin to include the rental registration information in our email update program, so now a resident in any neighborhood in the city can not only have access to the information, code enforcement information regarding the residential program, but at commercial, apartments, and rental property information as well. And then finally, as I mentioned, we talked to you about utilizing a score sheet, much like we do on the apartment inspection program, so that really a couple of things. One, that the owner and the tenant would know what we were coming to evaluate them on during the inspection process, but two, to increase our consistency as we go from home to home, and as is the case in many times as we go from inspector and inspector, utilizing this established criteria as our grading tool. We feel like that would be a much more effective policy, and it's proven very effective in the apartment inspection program as well, so there's some precedent there for it. There were just really two primary considerations that we visited about. One was the frequency of the inspections, and then finally two is the fee schedule, the method on which the fee would be based. So I'm going to take a little bit more time and run through these, because these considerations are really where the majority of the deliberation was headed. So frequency of inspections. We looked at four scenarios. One would be annually. And again, this is similar to what we currently do in the apartment inspection program. And of course, a couple of things we wanted to point out to you there. One is, of course, it guarantees that every rental property in the city would be inspected every year. Now, there's a couple of things that lead on to that. One is it provides for the continued and ongoing education of residents and property owners. So if you see them every year, you get to talk to them, you get to help them understand ways, different ordinances, how to comply, things of that nature. There was a big caveat to that, though, is that we felt like for owners, particularly those that experienced a high amount of turnover, this is actually a step backwards, because with some of the other options, you would actually get to go visit with them every time a change of occupancy occurred. So if that was the case, and you had an owner who was experiencing a high degree of turnover, that would be, in my opinion, where we'd want to focus our time, not necessarily someone who had a tenant for 5 years. And if you weren't getting a lot of feedback from that person or neighbors, you could probably assume that that was going to be a pretty good situation. So what we were saying essentially was that the additional inspections wouldn't necessarily equate proportionally to additional violations. We could be doing a lot of inspections at homes and not finding anything versus inspecting homes that we were more than likely going to find bigger issues or more substantial issues. So just because we were doing it on an annual basis didn't necessarily make it more effective. The second option was to inspect upon a change of occupancy prior to a tenant moving in. Again, similarities and other things that we do, this is very similar to a commercial certificate of occupancy. We go out, we make sure that the building is safe, or the home is safe in this case, prior to a tenant moving in. Again, we felt like this is, and this is kind of a theme throughout all of them, the first three at least, it will provide a better opportunity for us to provide educational materials. If we're talking to a tenant or a property owner before someone moves in, we can tell them what not to do as opposed to telling them what they're doing wrong. And that can be the case for the next scenario as well. Of course, it does provide an incentive for an owner to apply or to comply more. If they're waiting to have someone move in because you have a situation that they need to correct, then they're going to be more inclined to do that. However, I do want to say that in many cases, if this is a kind of carte blanche approach, in many situations we could potentially be holding folks up who need to move for a variety of reasons for not significant reasons. You wouldn't want to have a situation where you were letting us decide on a case-by-case basis necessarily. I mean, there would be some exceptions perhaps, but you don't want to do that on a grand scale, because then you open yourselves up to all kinds of possible reasoning from folks who aren't getting treated one way about why you're doing that. So I think that while you do provide that incentive, it may not be as effective. And then, of course, it is somewhat less intrusive for a resident than what we have now, because they wouldn't be there. The third option was upon a change of occupancy within 30 days. So within 30 days of the tenant moving in, the owner would be required to update the registration information, and the tenant would be required to allow us to come in and to conduct an inspection. This, of course, does not this option does not hinder an owner's ability to move forward. And of course, if you have a tenant who is in a difficult situation, this allows the tenant to make their transition. And the 30-day window there is not that long when you think about the types of violations that we're finding on a majority of our inspections. I think if you think of it compared to what we're doing now, in some cases it may be 8, 7, 6, or even if it's just 3 months more sooner than we're identifying the violations, it's still superior. So I think it strikes a nice balance between allowing the owner to move forward, not hindering tenants unnecessarily, but also getting us in to make the inspection in a timely manner, which is the second bullet there. Of course, it will provide, and this is an important point, if you go in before, you don't have any evidence, you can't make any observations with how many people could be occupying the building. If you go in and they're moved in, and obviously we do this now, you do have a sense of who's there, how many people are there, and it doesn't even have to be telltale signs. There are some indirect things that you can try to observe to try to determine how many people might be staying there. So that's a big benefit of this strategy, as well as the strategy we implement or we utilize now, is being able to actually confirm via observation, first-hand observation, how many people could be occupying the building. And then again, within a very short period of time, we can bring issues to our tenants. We can bring issues to a tenant's attention and ask them to do things differently in the future within just a short period of time there. And then the final option is our existing process upon a change of occupancy, which within the quadrant or the quarter. And of course, this obviously does not hinder an owner's ability to move folks in. It does help distribute the workload evenly, and one of the questions 2 weeks ago was about staffing implications and how the various options might impact us, and I'll talk about that in just a second. In terms of workload, again, periods of up to 9 or even 10 months may elapse between the time the occupancy changes and the registration and inspection is updated and performed. And again, that's the point making there. So with respect to our staffing implications, we conducted 1,100 inspections last year. If we were going to jump that up to 2,500 inspections, I don't see any way in which we could do that without adding another full-time inspector. We would not only be doubling the number of inspections, but moving to a more formal process using a score sheet and criteria of that nature. I suspect that we'll also be doing more re-inspections. So you're really talking about maybe adding, at a minimum, doubling the number of inspections that we would be conducting. So we would think at a minimum one full-time code enforcement officer would be required to do that. If you do upon a change of occupancy prior to the tenant moving in or within 30 days, I feel strongly that we can do this with adding just a part-time inspector. Now, there's a couple of advantages to this. If we are in either one of these scenarios, if we're going to create a time expectation on the part of property owners and tenants out there, we have to have someone trained and ready to step in for vacations, for unexpected sick leaves, for things of this nature. That does not by any means have to be a full-time person. I think we can effectively fill the voids by hiring a part-time inspector to do this. I think there's a couple other things we can do, and this kind of will play into staff's recommendation in a couple of slides. I think there's a couple other things we can do to actually enhance this program by using a part-time inspector in addition to our full-time. One is early morning and evening inspections. When I talk to folks, I hear over and over and over again about the 8 to 5 and how difficult it is if they work in downtown Dallas for them to come back to let us in and let us conduct the inspection. With the flexibility of a part-time person who is essentially could step in at any given time and fill in for a full-timer, we could offer some early morning and evenings and perhaps on occasion even some weekend inspections. What that would do for us is, one, it would help us achieve voluntary compliance more often. And it would really, in light of our staff recommendation here, would really add additional value for the owner and for the tenant to the program. And you can see the cost difference there is about, well, it's a little less than a third in that scenario. And then if we continue the current process, obviously there would be no additional staffing implications to consider.
Don, one question I have.
Sure.
You know, when we say we have 2,561 properties that are registered as rental, do we have a sense, and maybe this isn't there and I just didn't read ahead, but I think it's an important aspect to this, is that, you know, how often, what is the average turnover in these properties? Because is it 1 year after a completion of a lease? Is it 2 years? I mean, I'm venturing to say probably it's anywhere between 1 year and 2 years. So we're talking an additional, I mean, we could be talking an additional 1,500 inspections a year.
Exactly.
Or more.
Right.
I mean, assuming if we did make some changes, I'm just trying to kind of get my mind around this in conjunction with the cost factor.
Sure. We would be increasing on average about 1,300 inspections per year if we went to an annual. If we went to within 30 days or prior, we really wouldn't be increasing the number of inspections because it would just be triggered by the change of occupancy. The only
but I'm saying is that the within the, you know, right now 30 days. Well, I guess you're right, but I'm just thinking in terms of, okay, if it's say once a year,
right,
and you didn't have the, you know, right now we're based on once kind of whenever a tenant moves out and what quarter they're in and that kind of thing. If you really did it to where it's within 30 days of the move in or the move out, and it ends up being once a year, I think that does increase the number of inspections.
Well, we are still conducting for option 2 and 3. It's not necessarily that we'd be conducting more inspections. It's would we be conducting the inspection prior to the tenant moving in or within 30 days of the tenant moving in versus the change of occupancy occurs and then whenever their quarter comes subsequent to that. So we won't really be increasing the number of inspections.
Well, that's true, but what it does is it just changes when it occurs.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm trying to say is that changing the order of when it occurs impacts your staffing. That's
absolutely. And I think if we create an expectation by saying we will be there prior to the tenant moving in or we will be there within 30 days of the tenant moving in, we create an expectation. We have the flexibility now because we work on quarters.
That's right.
So we have the flexibility now of saying, okay, if our inspector is going to be off for a week, we won't schedule any inspections for that week. And it's just that easy. But if you create that expectation and I'm the tenant and I'm saying I need to move in by Saturday, we have to have somebody prepared to do that. And that's kind of where the you're only at this scenario, we're talking perhaps maybe 15 hours a week, and probably seasonally, when around the holidays and things of that nature, probably no time. And so that's where we arrive.
Or even just probably more towards the end and the beginning of each month. Really, that's what you're talking
Absolutely. We would be very strategic with when the person would be on and helping out. The other thing that this person could do in terms of just some very practical things is, identifying the rental properties. That takes time. I mean, currently we have one inspector assigned to the program. When he's looking through the newspaper, or he's surfing the internet looking for postings, he's not conducting inspections and he's not out there making connections. So the administrative part of that could be very helpful as well.
Okay.
Don, how much time does it take to usually do an inspection of a rental property?
Well, anywhere from about 45 minutes, on a smaller property. That's a great question. We will look, every inspection we get in an attic, so we go look for open wiring. Nowadays, it's very common, not as much as on new construction, but we still find folks relocating air conditioners and furnaces and water heaters to the attic so that they can gain some closet space, for instance. So every inspection we go into an attic, every inspection we look at all the mechanical equipment. We'll walk the property itself. A lot of times if a tenant's already in there, which the vast majority of time now they are, we'll spend time maybe answering questions for them, or if it's an owner. So to thoroughly canvass, a 1,500 square foot house, it's probably on maybe 35, 40 minutes, and then maybe upwards if it's a two-story. We may spend as much as an hour there. We spend sometimes as much time trying to schedule it as we do actually doing the inspection, trying to connect with an owner, find times back and forth via email or telephone calls, and it's very time-consuming on the front end as well. Alrighty. So the second consideration was obviously the fee schedule, what would the fee be based on? And as Bill mentioned, during the development of the fiscal year 11-12 budget, we recommended an increase in the annual inspection fee from $50 to $75, and predominantly that was two reasons was kind of at the crest of that. One was the enhancements we knew we would be making, or recommending, I should say, to you in terms of the amount of information, the type and quality of the inspection that we would be performing. The second was just on a survey, as we did when we recommended the increase in the apartment inspection annual fee. You can see the cities here that have the most similar programs. And I should mention we did survey all 13 cities. About a handful of them had no program, and then some programs were so different it wouldn't even be fair to make a comparison. And you would have seen some very high fees in those programs because of the way they're set up. But anyway, so you can see we're at the low end of $50 and the $75 range is very consistent with what cities, particularly Farmers Branch, which is the most similar program in terms of the way it's established. So
Don, on the change of an occupancy, is that within 30 days? Is that what is that similar to? Is it similar to our current policy, or is it within 30 days? Is it before the tenant moves in?
Sure. Most fall, they have 10 to 30 days. It's subsequent. No one is really set up on a quadrant basis like ours.
Yeah.
But Farmers Branch, for instance, is the 30-day. That's why I say it's probably the most similar to. They will do it prior or to the move-in if that's requested, and which we would as well. But at a minimum,
within 30 days.
30
Okay.
days is or I should say
I just want to make
maximum.
sure that we're apples and apples here. Thanks.
We're probably a little better, but.
Of course.
As you know, City Council opted at that time just to postpone that recommendation, adopting that recommendation, so we could have the conversation that we're having tonight. So there, as Mr. Mitchell mentioned, there are 2,500 or so rental properties, and this number changes pretty regularly as they fluctuate. If you look at our enforcement activity, 70% of those had at least one documented violation within the last 12 months. Now, I'm going to flip back and forth some additional information. I want to make something clear. These are interior. This number does not include interior violations, and that's important. And I just want to make sure that all the numbers gel as we go through. It's important because we really didn't begin to track those in a reportable fashion until around June, when we incorporated the rental program into our existing database that we use for code enforcement. And I'll explain the difference in just a second. So these numbers are only the numbers that we were able to pull on the code enforcement side and then attribute to rental property by merging the two databases. So about 70% had at least one documented violation. The average was about 1.95 or 2 violations per year. So there are two options that we wanted to share with you for the fee schedule. One would be based on the outcome of the actual inspection itself. And we suggested, as we have in the apartment inspection program, that if a property received an 85 or above, they would pass. If they received an 85 or below, they would fail, and then they would pay an increased fee, which would be assessed in the form of a reinspection fee for failing and requiring city staff to come out and essentially conduct a second follow-up inspection. Again, just some of the ideas on this as far as we believe. One is very easy for owners to understand. We believe by using a score sheet, having a criteria out there that we can send with our annual registration renewal reminders online, it's going to be very difficult for an owner to say, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what I was supposed to do in advance of this. I think that it's much more manageable and easy for staff to defend the way we're evaluating. You know, one of the things the apartments always like to do is compare, and now because all of our information is out there, they can do that. And I think it's a real compliment to our apartment inspection team that you don't hear a lot of complaining about how one apartment's being evaluated compared to another. Even when we fail the apartments or take them before the Building and Standards Commission, you're not hearing that they're being treated unfairly, and it's because we have such a regimented, systematic, methodical way of evaluating them. So I think that could be very, very helpful in the rental as well. And then obviously it's much easier to track and be able to report and to be able to use that information to improve the program in the future. And believe it or not, it actually results in less administrative duty, less administrative duties than some of the other options. So one of the questions that was raised 2 weeks ago was how many properties would we anticipate failing? Now, this is what I wanted to make the clear distinction of. This analysis was based on the work that we've done since June with the program, so it does include both interior and exterior violations. Now, obviously, we haven't had a score sheet in place for these past 3 months, but what we did was we went back and evaluated the last 3 months by actually looking at each of our inspection reports that we have now and saying, would this have clearly passed? Would it have been borderline, or would it have clearly failed? And I think that's probably, those are pretty wide ranges there, but it's, at this juncture, looking back, it was, I thought, the safest and most accurate information we could report to you, instead of trying to attribute some actual number to all the inspections we did. So you can see there's 119 inspections over the 3-month period. We feel like 97 of those would have clearly scored 85 or above. There wasn't much consideration there. And then these numbers just happen to work out at 11 and 11. So on the high end, you could say potentially over these 3 months, as many as 18% could have failed. On the low end, for sure, 9 or say 10% would have definitely failed. So that kind of gives you a range. Now, probably the truth over 12 months would probably somewhere right in between there. So maybe 10 to 15% of total properties would fail. That's not that unlike the apartments, to be honest with you. It's a little lower. It's about 7% a year generally fail their annual inspection over the last 4 years. So the number is somewhat consistent in terms of a percentage. So at this juncture, this is probably the best and safest, most accurate estimation we can make on the numbers. Are there any questions about that? Alrighty. The second option was fee-based on the number of violations documented at a given property over the course of a period of time, so perhaps a year, for instance. And there were a couple of considerations we wanted to throw out there for you to think about. One is, would that include owner and tenant violations, or would it just include one or the other? So, an owner is clearly responsible for repairing a roof, whereas a tenant is responsible for not putting the trash out early. So would a tenant who repeatedly put the trash out early, and if that number of violations push them over the threshold, would that owner be held accountable and have to pay a higher rate or lose a discount, for instance? The severity of the violation, would all violations be created equal? Would a missing address be considered equal to a missing smoke detector? it's not, one's a life safety issue and one is more of a maintenance or a property standards issue. So would those violations be considered equal if we were trying to attribute or assign some value to them in a scheme of that nature? The complaints versus the regular inspections, rental properties are more susceptible to complaints, probably for a variety of reasons, but we would definitely want to have you consider the fact, if somebody really wanted to drive up the number of issues, they could repeatedly, in terms of trying to make somebody's life a little bit more difficult for whatever reason, they could repeatedly call in and have us out there almost on a daily basis if they wanted to have us be responsive. And then I think it would be a little more difficult for residents to understand and for staff to administer, because I think probably what you would land on is some kind of a weighting to the different types of violations, some kind of a assignment to owner versus tenant. So we would have to figure out a way to keep all that manageable and make sure that if someone had to pay more or did not receive a discount, we could justify that and explain that to them in a way that they would feel was satisfactory. So those were a few considerations that we wanted to run through on the fee schedule. And just to kind of give you an idea on that, much like how many perhaps would fail or score below 85, you would have to consider, you would have to settle on a threshold in a situation like this. So what we did for you here was, these are the documented exterior violations. And again, we wanted to go longer than 3 months, so this is again over the period of a year versus just the 3 months. But you could see, the total number of properties. If one was the threshold, all 1,799 of the properties that we were able to evaluate would have reached that. But if you pick something in the 5 to 6 to 7, you can kind of get an idea of how many properties would be paying an additional fee above and beyond what other properties who fell below that threshold would be. So it would obviously be completely up to City Council to decide on what that level was. We do have a staff recommendation for you, consistent with what we recommended back during the budget considerations. We still feel it's entirely reasonable to raise the $50 annual registration fee to a $75 registration fee. I think that what owners and the general public is going to encounter over the next couple of months with the increased emphasis on sharing information about the program, the increased emphasis on making sure that owners and tenants have information early on in the process and know what to expect. I think that the expenses incurred in administrating the program are naturally going to be higher than what they were just even a year or two ago, but definitely more than when the $50 was originally adopted as the annual fee. So I think that's reasonable. We also would recommend requiring inspection upon a change of occupancy within 30 days. I think this strikes a nice balance of not potentially holding up an owner from using their property as a rental, also not potentially holding up a tenant from making a transition when they have to get out from somewhere else, for instance, but also allows us to get in within a very reasonable amount of time to make sure that any issues that we identify can be addressed in a timely manner versus the scenario that we find ourselves in sometimes now. Obviously, we feel very strongly about updating the evaluation criteria and using a score sheet as we move forward. We'd like to suggest again that if you score an 85 or above, that you pay just the annual inspection fee. If you score an 84, I should say, and below, I guess you can't get 85 both ways, but if you score an 84 or below, you would be charged an additional fee of $75 for our reinspection. And if we came back 2 times, then you'd just be charged 1. 3 times, you'd be charged, just like in the apartments, $75 for each of those subsequent reinspections. When we go back and do a reinspection, it still requires the same amount of setup time. It requires the same amount of staff time, the same amount of gas to drive there. So it makes sense that the fee would be similar to what it was on the inspection. And of course, you do still incent and provide an incentive for owners to comply. If they have the information and know what we're coming to look for in advance of their annual inspection, there is an incentive to comply, because you are not potentially going to face a reinspection fee, which essentially doubles your annual inspection fee for not doing those things that you could do otherwise. Obviously, we need to finalize a strategy for both of these issues. We will have to amend the code, the ordinance. Probably what we'll be doing in a very short period of time is incorporating your feedback and suggestions in the direction that you give us, make those code enhancements, and bringing them back to you for consideration, I would imagine, in the next 1 to 2 weeks. Then we begin publicizing this. We're at a great point in time where if we if we make these decisions and get the code of ordinances in the right shape and adopt it, we can begin promoting this in December. And the Richardson Today, for instance, we can do our email updates, and we can send a letter to every registered owner that we have here, giving them a full month in advance to prepare for the changes that would take place in January of 2012. We definitely want to do it on January 1st. This, as I mentioned, this is an ideal to make a change in the program if that's what we decide to do, or if that's what you decide to do, because we would want it to start off at January, because those folks have already gone through a full cycle, and that way everybody next year will be on the first cycle of the new rules and guidelines for that. So that's our presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Mr. Omar?
Mr. Mayor, I was going to ask if it was all right, we all kind of took a turn at this and weighed in so that we'd have an opportunity to be able to give proper amount of guidance, if that's all right with you.
That's fine.
All right.
Any general questions right now? Okay, Mr. Solomon, you got any comments?
Yes, sir. Mr. Mayor and Don, do you have any idea what the actual cost is for an inspection? You know, I'm a big one in believing that I own my home, I don't rent it. You know, why should I pay for, why should my tax dollars be used to pay for what I expect that owner of that property to be doing on a routine basis? It's just our role is to enforce to make the neighborhood safe and secure, the places to be a safe and secure places for the tenants to live,
Yes, sir.
and we expect that. But as a result of the failure of some to do that, we have to go out and do these inspections
Right.
and pass the ordinances and the codes to make people comply. So my point is, if we have to do that, that's outside the scope of our regular governmental activity. And so therefore, I think that those people who are forcing that activity need to pay for that activity.
Sure.
I have no problem defending that point. I think most of my residents, would agree with that. So do we have any idea about what, is it $200? Is it $35? And I don't want this to be just a fee just that we pulled out of the air, but do we have some substantiation for why we want to say it's $75? I was the one that wanted to raise it to $50, 3 years ago, and we got that done because I just thought it was just too low. But I'd be happy to make it $150 if that's what you tell me the cost of doing it is.
You don't make cost recovery, Mark?
Yes, cost recovery.
So
That's a good point.
So one way of trying to get at that number is to say we have one full-time staff person assigned to conducting inspections, responding to citizen complaints, conducting the re-inspections that we currently do, issuing citations, going to court, attending court on behalf of the city, researching rental properties to try to identify and make sure that we have them registered. So a whole slew of responsibilities associated with the program administration. So if you look at that person's the cost of employing that person and you divide that by the number of inspections, you come up with about $66 per inspection. Now that doesn't by any means account for that person's supervisor who is accustomed to talking to folks, and doesn't include my time when I deal with rental registration, or doesn't include the court's time when citations are issued, which we issue on this program around 300 citations a year is what it's going to average out to be.
IS time.
Exactly. So there's a variety of cost associated with, but if you just look at that one person, the $75 is about $12.
It's pretty close then. Okay.
I think, and that's looking at other cities, that's generally how they approach this when they were trying to decide on what would be a reasonable amount to increase, because a lot of them, as you saw, were at $50 as well, and we're looking to make sure that we were at least recouping, for the most part, the cost associated with implementing a program like this. So it's a fair rationale, I believe.
Sure. I think it's very fair.
Yes,
when we look at what we're having to settle on. All right. The other issue is the pre-occupancy, the pre-inspection prior to someone moving in, and the inspection after someone moves in. The concern that I have after someone moves in is I realize that the need to check the number of occupancy, and that's a big issue. I know I have a rental house not too far from mine, and you've checked on it several times recently, and we just want to make sure that we have the right number of people living in a home. I understand that need, but on the other hand is if we have a major violation of a code, a health code, a water heater that is not proper, electrical outlets, as I've seen pictures of some of just a light bulb hanging down, which somebody converted a laundry room into a bedroom sort of thing and made it into that. Those are major code violations. Well, it would appear to me that would be an unsafe habitat for a family. We would not want a family living in that kind of a habitat. So if they're already living there, and we're just now finding that out, do we move them out? Do we force them to move out? Do they get their deposits back? All these kind of issues, where if we saw those things prior to them moving in, they have to be corrected before they can occupy that premises. And so that's sort of my concern on that issue. And wouldn't we find out the number of people living there by resident neighborhood complaint? And then wouldn't we have the opportunity to inspect based upon that complaint-driven inquiry also?
Okay, let me start at the first question.
Was that a statement or a question?
Yeah, that was a.
With respect to the difference between going in prior to and subsequent to, I believe, and this is my personal feeling on dealing.
You do it every day, not us.
Right. If it's a situation where, if it's a dangerous situation and it's a family, for instance, or even if it's a group of folks that have come together, 2 or 3 individuals that have come together, they are not shy about bringing dangerous situations to our attention.
Right.
It's very, if it's exposed to electrical, and honestly, if it's up in the attic, you do see that quite often, but you very rarely walk into a house and see just a receptacle, sticking out of the wall, or a light fixture with the cap off, or the things that we see most of the time are going to be things that are kind of hidden away anyway. So you're not going to have anything. I'm just trying to think as we got more involved in this program again, going in, you don't see anything really overtly dangerous as you're walking through. And when you do, it doesn't take long for a resident to contact you. I mean, if it's that obvious and it's that common sense-wise, then the resident, as soon as they get there, they're going to know that. Now, you do run into a situation sometimes where you say, well, what do you do if it is a dangerous situation? If it's electrical and it's exposed, then that's a pretty easy fix. You can tell an owner, and I've done this before in apartments, say you can either move this person out by the end of the day, or you can have it repaired by the time they get back from work, or by the time they get back home from school. It's just that serious, and you can have those repaired immediately like that. You can section off a part and say this cannot be occupied until this violation is corrected. A hot water heater, if it was dangerous enough, we could call, and it was gas, we could call Atmos and say they need to turn it off, and then they may have cold water for a day or two, but so you can remedy that. On the flip side, the second part of the question was, is it an advantage to get in after the fact because you do get to see who is there? I've found that we get more information from visiting with residents after they move in, particularly the situation when you have individuals or perhaps 2 related individuals and a second, a third that's not related. We get more information from visiting with them upon an inspection or in response to a complaint than we could ever get from the registration form. You just can, it's a blunt tool, and when you're out there, you're visiting with them, you're walking from room to room, you really do see things that, and then you can ask questions, or if you don't think you're going to get the answer an honest answer, you can follow up and you can be very deliberate and you can catch people doing things. You can get vehicle, you can get license numbers.
Right. How
many vehicles should be here on if I come here on 6 o'clock in the morning, how many people am I going to see sleeping here? And you can really get information from that. So that's very valuable If you look at the number, and that's why with both the apartments and with the rental registration, if you look at the emphasis that we're placing on grading, it's not on mechanical, it's not on electrical, it's not on plumbing, because we don't see an overwhelming majority of problems with that. It's on property standards, it's on the symptoms that we generally see and have to deal with when you have a bad rental situation. So there's definitely, I mean, it's a good point on both sides.
All right, I can do that.
And Don raises a really good point, or a couple good points, but there's also, we want to make sure that from the tenant side as well as from the owner's side, that we don't hold up folks from being able to do business.
I agree.
And so while if we have it within 30 days, we feel like obviously that's the longest we want to wait, but our goal would be to get in there as soon as possible. But we don't want to, not only looking from the owner's standpoint, but also the tenant. Tenant has plans to move in, and we're keeping that from occurring because of some situation. So.
Well, I agree. One last question. On the educational issues, I think you and I discussed briefly the concept of seminars, very similar to what you're doing now with your apartment managers, very similar to what you're doing with the realtors and others, bringing them in and sitting, making it available, the homeowners associations, etc. But bringing them in at least maybe annually or semi-annually, saying we're going to have a session today in the morning, and the next session could be in the evening, where the owners of these properties could come in here in this room or wherever and sit down with you and the staff, and you tell them exactly what we are expecting and let them know what we expect a responsible property owner in the city of Richardson to do. Sure. And I think that would be a very, very good thing, and I'd like to see that part of the actual program, that we program that into whichever scenario we do.
Right.
So.
Good. Thank you for that.
Mr. Dunn?
Don, I know 2 weeks ago we kind of listed, but what is the overall purpose of the rental registration? If you could highlight that again right now.
I think there are two. One is obviously to make sure that a tenant has a healthy, safe environment to occupy. And the second is to make sure that that property, which is not being used as a single-family owner-occupied dwelling, does not negatively impact the adjacent properties, which the majority of will very likely be single-family owner-occupied. So we're looking at it from 2 points, I think. One is the overall community, whether it's the block or the neighborhood or the community in general, to make sure that if someone is going to use their home as a rental property, that it doesn't negatively impact that larger picture. And then secondly, to make sure that the folks that are within those walls have a safe and healthy place to live.
All right. I didn't have much more than that. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Maczka?
Thank you. Okay, I just had a couple comments more than anything. Thank you, Mr. Solomon, for raising the cost recovery, because I think that's really important. And based on your explanation, $75 seems fairly reasonable to me. Seems like a nice balance between what we were charging and what it costs. In terms of which suggestion I would support, my concerns about requiring the inspections before moving in, there's a couple of concerns that I would have. One, the staffing ability to pull it off. I think you potentially open us up for huge criticism. And I kind of had 4 groups that are affected by that decision. Obviously the owner who's trying to get it, but the one that we don't really talk about that much, and my friends who own rental properties don't necessarily do the leasing themselves. They hire realtors to do that. So you're adding in someone else who's being burdened by this whole process. Of course, the person who wants to move in quickly, but the kind of other part that we're not really talking that much about are all those neighbors who are living around that house. Because I know that the rental properties in my neighborhood, people are very anxious to have bodies in those houses because they want to include them in the neighborhood and they want to bring that property back up. And in our neighborhood, we actually encourage them to join the HOA. We have a large number of rental properties that are members of the HOA. So I would hate to slow any of that down. So my support would be the 30 days for the reasons I just mentioned. And then also I think the ability for us to kind of set the bar about what we expect of rental properties, because I think that if you have the opportunity to visit with those people living there, I mean, you guys can basically imply, look, this isn't just a place that you can, sneak out of here at midnight. We really take this seriously. We take your safety seriously. We take the way the house looks seriously. So we expect you to be good leasers, and hopes that those people will eventually have the funds to become owners. I mean, that's ultimately what I would want all of them to be. So, and I also concur with Mr. Solomon on the, I think we should look for an opportunity to bring these folks together, the HOAs, the owners, about the leasing. And then finally, I would really like to see the early AM, PM, and weekend done, because I think that typically the leasers are leasing because they, quite frankly, can't afford to buy the house. So, to have that convenience, again, it makes us business friendly and leaser friendly. So those are my comments.